Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Seth Masket. I'm a professor of political science and director of the Center on American Politics here at the University of Denver. Thank you for joining us today for a discussion with Professor Theda Skocpol about her new edited volume, Upending American Politics. I want to briefly mention that the Center on American Politics has a number of great discussions coming up leading up to the November election. Next Tuesday, October 13th, we have a discussion of voting rights and voter suppression. Tuesday the 20th, we have a discussion of the Electoral College and the ballot measure that appears on the Colorado ballot this fall. The Coloradan voters have to deal with it. You can read about these and other upcoming events at our website, du.edu/AmericanPolitics. But for today, along with her co-author, Carolyn Turvo, our guest, Theda Skocpol, has recently completed a book called Upending American Politics. I have a copy of it right here, published by Oxford University Press. This book covers a wide range of ground on recent issues of critical importance to American politics, particularly stemming from the 2016 election cycle. It includes contributions from a range of authors, including Vanessa Williamson, Laura Putnam, Alexander Hertel Fernandez, as well as the editors themselves. It includes studies of Donald Trump's campaigning in 2016 in rural white communities, analyses of the network style of organization in the Tea Party and the Koch brothers organization and Indivisible, includes some chapters on the nature of the anti-Trump resistance, and some works on the polarization of America's political parties. Given that American politics keeps getting upended, like literally every hour, we're excited to have our guest with us today to discuss just what some of this research is telling us. Theda Skocpol is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard University. At Harvard, she has served as the Dean of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, as well as Director of the Center for American Political Studies. She's been elected to membership in the American Academy of Arts and Science, the American Philosophical Society, and the National Academy of Sciences. She's an award-winning author of numerous books and articles and one of the leading scholars in understanding modern American conservatism and the Tea Party movement. I'm also pleased to be joined today by Christopher Celaya. Chris is the postdoctoral scholar with the Center on American Politics here at the University of Denver for the 2020 through 22 academic years. Chris studies how deliberation affects political knowledge and decision-making. He holds a recent PhD in political science from Harvard University, and he has just completed a research fellowship with the Mind-Brain Behavior Interfaculty Initiative at Harvard University. So here's how this will work. Chris and I will alternate in asking questions to Theda. We will then open up the floor for questions from our audience. If you have a question, please feel free to type it in using the Q&A button that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will be fielding those questions as they come in. If you're interested, we also have a chat button available that's also at the bottom of your screen. This is great. This is basically an opportunity to have an online chat with other people watching this panel right now. And please feel free to use that by identifying yourself by your name, where you're writing from. We certainly encourage that. But again, if you want to ask a question of us here on the screen, please use the Q&A button. Okay. So my first question for Theda. So there are several chapters in this book that are devoted to understanding Donald Trump's victory in 2016, with a particular focus on his campaigning in rural white communities in the upper Midwest and a few other states. I'm wondering if you see an attempt to repeat this strategy this year. You know, what was it that made this an unusually successful outreach in 2016, and do you see that paying off in 2020 as well?
Thanks, Seth. I'm delighted to be here and have a chance to participate in this discussion with you and with Chris and with the members who've logged on. You know, Upending American Politics brings together a series of very closely interrelated studies, and they all have something methodological in common, which is that we emphasize looking at organizations, including grassroots organizations and networks, and how they magnify the influence, sometimes of fairly small groups of activists, as well as elite actors in politics. And, you know, one of the chapters by myself and Michael Zurub, who's a PhD candidate at Harvard, looks at what we call the surprising organizational basis of Donald Trump's 2016 victory. You know, if we can remember back 4 years ago when everybody assumed Donald Trump had no chance to win, the spotlight, including by, I would say, political scientists, was on the amazing amount of free media time he was able to get as a TV reality show maestro and somebody who threw out constant verbal provocations, which he's continuing to do. I mean, as we speak, every few hours right now. But what we saw beneath the surface back then, and I think it's still going on now, although in slightly transformed ways, is that somebody in the Trump campaign understood that tapping into networks of organizations that could reach right down into the daily life of conservative-minded, usually Republican voters, but sometimes others, living in non-metropolitan areas would be a good way to squeeze out some extra votes, particularly in the key states he ended up swinging, Pennsylvania above all. And so you could take a look at the way in which, in a very transactional way, a New York libertine who had been probably pro-choice, probably in practice as much as precept, made a deal step by step with evangelical Christian elites, ended up putting together a council of them, stressing those who had radio networks. And that tapped in turn to where a lot of people out there live their lives, which is attending church, not just on Sundays, but often on Wednesday. And there's excellent social science research that shows that they're good citizens. They vote above their weight in the population. The same thing happened with the gun networks, starting with a deal with the National Rifle Association. But the National Rifle Association isn't just a national lobby with a lot of money to spend. It's also connected into gun clubs, gun training programs, and that reaches into the life, particularly of men who hunt together and shoot together and think of themselves as a certain kind of citizen protecting others. And then finally, and most interestingly, given that the 2016 campaign was marked as this one is now by the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests against police shootings, Michael Zurab was able to find a data set online, a leaked data set. Leaked data sets are to be recommended, that identified where the Fraternal Order of Police had lodges and members. And since the Fraternal Order had not endorsed Romney because he was anti-union, but did endorse Trump and put a lot of effort behind him, could do a statistical test to show that they created an added oomph of support for Donald Trump, who of course, when he appeared before natural groups, usually appeared at Christian right conventions, gun conventions, and in front of Fraternal Order of Police lodges to declare his solidarity with forces of law and order. So those elements really were pretty important in sinking popular roots for this campaign and magnifying the vote that he got that put him over the top, the high margins he got in non-big city areas in states like Michigan and Pennsylvania. Is he still doing it? Absolutely. What he offered to these folks was very clear: Supreme Court appointments. Those Supreme Court appointments have been delivered upon, and the one that is pending now is a dream for all of these networks. Furthermore, the clash between Black Lives Matter and more Americans who see the issue of police violence against minorities as problematic, and the various law and order forces that Trump wants to mobilize is more pertinent than ever. And I'll just add one thing. I think there's reason to believe that in the interim, Trump has taken over the Republican Party, turned its organizational apparatus very much to his devices, and used it in a state like Ohio, for example, our research shows, to make up for the troubles the NRA has run into. They've simply gotten the gun owner lists that nobody else can get and the membership lists, and they're using those to mobilize those loyalists this time.
So hi, I also want to say thank you for talking about your book, for showing up, and allowing me this opportunity to ask you some questions. So as you know, and the other half of the story, I think, there's this organizational push to, this pro Trump push, but there's also, the earlier like anti-Obama push, right? And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how these organizational structures might differ between those two things, and then should we expect the same kind of anti-Biden push that we saw for similar to what we saw as anti-Obama?
Well, the answer to that latter is yes. The folks on the right will not stand down if there's a Biden presidency. But the linchpin of this book in many ways is the remarkable fact that following the 2008 election, and again 8 years later, you had what I try to explain to my students is a rare occurrence in American politics, although it doesn't seem rare to them, which is a controversial president, controversial to the other partisans, elected at the same time as a House and Senate, controlled by, in this case, his party. And so back in 2009, we saw the emergence of the Tea Party, certainly the mobilization of funders and the Koch network, which was already operating at that time, and the various Washington, D.C. operatives around Mitch McConnell and the Republican leadership that was going to put up an obstruction to the Obama administration. But you also saw an explosion of grassroots voluntary organizing by citizens on the right. And Vanessa Williamson and I wrote about that then and again in this book, because we now think probably 2,000 grassroots groups regularly meeting around the country, very much motivated in somewhat different ways than the elites, more by anger at Obama, fear of Obama as the other. That came out in the interviews that we did, and we know now from even Pew Research and other sources that surviving Tea Party activists and sympathizers are the hardcore of Donald Trump's support and are thrilled by his anti-immigrant message above all, and his determination to blot out everything Barack Obama achieved as president. So that obsession is shared by those grassroots supporters just with Donald Trump. Then flash forward 8 years later, when Trump is I think surprisingly elected, most people were surprised, it took even less time for Americans of liberal persuasion or even moderate centrists to, and as well as progressive leftists, to start organizing. And once again, we see my research group has documented up to 3,000 regularly meeting grassroots groups. And by regularly meeting, I mean both Tea Parties and resistance groups at the grassroots will meet in the back rooms of restaurants or in libraries or sometimes church basements, although very different churches we're talking about here on the two sides. And citizens get involved in understanding all levels of politics, how gerrymandering works, who to contact, and create an extra oomph going into the next midterm elections in both 2010 and 2018. So this is pretty amazing, especially for somebody like me who studied the dwindling of grassroots face-to-face groups in American civic life, along with Bob Putnam. They virtually collapsed in the late 20th century, but here we are in one decade seeing two massive movements that weren't just protests in the street on a few days, but were also ongoing, regularly meeting networks that channeled new citizen energy into the base of politics in the Republican and Democratic parties.
Thanks for that. I want to jump in with a question. I was hoping to ask you a little bit about this new style of networked activism that it gets depicted in this book, whether we're talking about the Tea Party or the Koch brothers or others, which seems it's very grassroots in its nature, but is also sometimes working in concert with elite, well-funded organizations. And I was wondering if you could explain a little bit, is this a new style of activism in this country? Does this differ from earlier models of political organization, whether earlier protest movements or party machines or something like that? How is this new?
Well, let me say that I think both the Tea Party and the resistance are terms that encompass intersecting fields of organizations and actors, both top-down ones and bottom-up ones. And if we're talking about top-down ones, I think the kind of professionally run advocacy politics and big money funding operations outside the two major political parties, but trying to leverage them, that we've seen in the last 4 or 5 decades, those are active in both of these movements. So in the Tea Party case, Freedom Works, Americans for Prosperity, which is the core federated organization in the Koch network, these are extra party in the sense that they aren't the same thing as the institutional Republican Party, but they can channel a lot of resources and to some degree get in touch with activists on their email lists. But that's not all the Tea Party was. It was also these thousands of voluntarily organized face-to-face meeting groups that sprung up from below and had slightly different goals. Everybody, top and bottom, was opposed to Barack Obama and the Democratic agenda, but the grassroots people are somewhat more motivated by anti-immigrant and ethno-nationalist passions, whereas the top-down people there outside, alongside the Republican Party, had been pushing the anti-global warming, tax cuts for the wealthy, evisceration of public sector unions and business regulations. Now, the same thing has happened in the resistance. I think a lot of people who study the resistance treat it as if it were the people who appear on MSNBC. The head of Move On, or Leah Greenberg and Ezra Levin from Indivisible, or usually people from pro-immigrant organizations. There are more advocacy groups in the field in the resistance because Democrats tend to organize around a zillion different identities and a lot of different policy priorities, but they sit in offices in Washington too and spend a lot of money and argue over which candidates to endorse. And that's very different from the grassroots resistance. And you might say, well, how do you know, Theda? Well, I happen to have been visiting 8 counties, 2 apiece in North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. I would have been visiting again this fall if I weren't sitting at home because of the pandemic. And I've gotten to know the leaders of the local Democratic and Republican parties and the Tea Parties where they still meet, and the resistance groups. All of them, even in pro-Trump counties, have resistance groups. And these are teachers, healthcare workers, librarians, small business women. They are 80% women. In that sense, they're different from the Tea Party, which was about half and half at the activist grassroots, men and women, usually married couples. But they meet face-to-face in the same kinds of places, and they're engaged in a push from below to put, to buoy the chances of Democrats against Republicans and to fight for the survival of the Affordable Care Act, to push environmental priorities, to stand up for minorities and immigrants and refugees. And their priorities are usually more practical than the advocates in Washington. And they are, at the grassroots, the groups are rarely involved in writing letters to Nancy Pelosi to tell her that they'll no longer support her if she doesn't close down the government over this or that issue. So the style of politics is different inside the resistance, just as it was in the Tea Party. And so some of the priorities are also different at the 2 levels.
Is that actually a great transition for my next question, which is I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit more about what does Upending American Politics have to say about the nature of political influence? So specifically, we're thinking in terms of, is it more focused on policy change? Is it more focused on getting people elected? And is it more effective at one of those two? And does that differ between parties?
Well, I think it's fair to say that the insight, not too revolutionary, that political scientists have, that you have to get elected before you can affect policy, is widely shared by activists in both of these outpourings of civic and advocacy energy. And if anything, the resistance that emerged under Donald Trump at the grassroots was even more devoted to getting out the vote, registering voters, and removing obstacles to voting than was true for the grassroots Tea Party. The grassroots Tea Party were older whites who could sort of take it for granted that their fellow older whites would turn out to vote in the 2010 midterm election. That was always an anxiety for the resistance from the moment that they started working, because Democratic constituencies often don't turn out, have in the past, didn't turn out so much in midterm elections. But both of these movements, and you asked in an earlier question something I didn't answer, is this brand new or is this old? You know, it's both. Because these groups use a combination of the electronic means, meetup websites back in the Tea Party, Facebook, and sometimes Twitter for the resistors now. But they also have these face-to-face meetings, which when you attend them are very much like the meetings that the local clubs and lodges and unions and federated organizations used to have. Tea Party meetings start with a Pledge of Allegiance and a prayer. That couldn't be more traditional. Resistance meetings are more like a college, seminar, but people are face-to-face, they socialize for a while, and they say ritual type things about what our purposes and values are before they plunge into the practical work. And so these are these are Americans reinventing things that almost seem to be in American DNA. It doesn't seem to take Americans very long to figure out how to organize things if the occasion arises. And in both of these moments, people were literally shocked into thinking they were going to lose their version of America. And the rhetoric that people engage in the Tea Party and the resistance is eerily similar. People say, I'm getting involved because I suddenly realized voting wasn't enough. We could lose the point of our country, the whole purpose of our country. So that kind of engagement that goes beyond economic self-interest and goes beyond simply issue specifics to a sense of civic purpose and even a call to historic engagement, I think that's very American. And we're seeing it in new waves here because the polarization of our political system and the fact that two utterly unexpected presidents who were shocking and frightening to the other side could emerge within 8 years of each other have come together.
Thanks for that.
And they're thinking about policies, but they're thinking about policies, values, and electing people, all of those. So it's not specialized. It's much more melding all of those forms of activism together.
You had mentioned earlier about the Trump campaign in 2016 and their alliance with police unions and with evangelical groups, and just doing a lot of organization along those ways. I mean, I know these are groups that are normally more aligned toward Republican candidates, but it seemed like the Trump campaign had an unusually, aggressive and very deliberate outreach to these communities. And I'm wondering if you saw, were they really working for him and with him because he courted them, basically, or because there was a particular ideological compatibility there that there wasn't necessarily with the Romney campaign or with the Bush campaign or McCain campaigns in the past?
I would call it a mood meld. One of the things that I did in the work that both the Tea Party research and some of the other authors in this volume have actually been out and met face-to-face with activists and talked with them, which is a wonderful way to get a sense of people's emotion and intensity, as well as simply a questionnaire that asks them to check off, say, issue priorities. So, but for the chapter on the organizational basis of the Trump campaign, I actually went and read some of the latest research by sociologists and anthropologists that try to go beyond interest group studies in looking at the gun organizations and networks and the Christian right. And the best research in recent years shows that what really goes on in those communities is that people are interacting regularly in settings where they're getting a message about what makes for good citizens and good citizenship, and also getting a very scary message about what secular liberals, like many of us on this Zoom, are doing to America. It is an apocalyptic message. It is a message of fear, anger, and deep concern about the changing ethnic and generational and racial mores of American society. And in different forms, that kind of worldview is pervaded in conservative evangelical church communities. It is certainly conveyed in kind of gun networks where people think of themselves as protectors. That's what some of the good research shows about gun ownership and carrying guns. And it links over into some of the militias that we're seeing, but most of them aren't militia members. Most of them are regular folks living not very far out into the non-urban areas of the state you're in. And I've interviewed many people from these networks, and they're perfectly good people in their way of thinking about life, except that they believe some really, really scary things about the other side. Trump was brilliant at tapping into that kind of anger and fear. And of course, it goes without saying that in appealing to police networks and prison guards and immigration guards against the fearful immigrants or people who would criticize police for dealing with what police think of as dangerous criminals, he's very good at tapping into those apocalyptic understandings of who's out to get you for being a good American. So it does go beyond simply a transaction. But I think for Trump, it was simply a transaction. And I think it is to this day.
I'm going to change speed a little bit, maybe ask a slightly less apocalyptic question. One of the most interesting things for me that the book claimed was that this new type of grassroots plus top-down organizing is less likely to move the Democratic Party to the left as it is to move the Republican Party to the right. And I was wondering if you could speak about, you're looking at where Joe Biden has positioned himself, whether or not, do you think that still holds? Do you think he's moving left, or do you think he represents the Democratic Party shifting more centrist?
Well, I don't know whether you saw the column that Tom Edsall did in the New York Times just this weekend, where he was asking these questions about insurgents and establishments on the two sides. What I told him is I didn't really buy that parallel entirely. And number of the authors in this book have actually thought about what is the net impact of the new activism particularly at the grassroots near a mostly withered state and local, particularly local Democratic Party apparatus. What's its impact going to be? I mean, if you listen to the leaders of national resistance groups, they'll tell you it's uniformly toward the left. And they'll point to things like passion for Bernie Sanders' candidacy or Elizabeth Warren's candidacy during the Democratic primaries. There's no question that the 75 to 80% females, college-educated females, who have been the organizers of the grassroots resistance across the country, preferred, probably a plurality of them preferred Elizabeth Warren to be the nominee. But you notice how quickly they moved on and responded to Elizabeth Warren herself, and to some degree to Bernie Sanders, when they said, well, you know, we've got a larger cause here. We need to get behind Joe Biden. Joe Biden and the campaign around him have also signaled a willingness to find creative compromises that ooch Biden toward the policy left. And if they are elected with a Democratic Senate, I believe they will enact some of the most progressive voting reforms, healthcare enhancements, college affordability reforms, and green jobs, green energy policies, much more than has been imaginable for quite some time. So yes, things are moving to the left, but compare that to the Tea Party and Koch network's effect on the Republican Party, which has been to cause it to jump off a cliff to the right. First, the Koch network drew Republican candidates and office holders into pursuing policies that were and are terribly unpopular, including the continued obsession with getting rid of the Affordable Care Act to this very day. And on the other hand, the ethno-nationalist tendencies are not popular, of taking such a draconian attitude toward immigrants and refugees. So I must say, in my visits around the country, I find conservatives often most troubled by the ruthlessness toward immigrants and refugees, particularly if they have some in their communities and they know them. So these are extreme measures that grassroots Tea Partiers, for the most part, pushed. And they pushed an uncompromising style onto the GOP, which helped to limit Barack Obama's presidency and his gains. But I don't think we see anything like that on the resistance side. We may see some resistance leaders in Washington announcing that they'll never compromise, but that is not what the vast majority of grassroots resistors do. They get behind moderate liberals if those are the people that can win in their states and their districts. And most of the people who won in 2018, most of the people who will win this year are not AOC, because that's not what the districts are like. And I'll just say finally, the Democratic Party's dilemma in this era has been that it was increasingly cut off from having even a voice or a presence outside of college towns and big metropolises. This grassroots resistance movement, led by older women who are often not even treated with respect by Democratic Party paid consultants, and they know it, by the way. They know they're treated as kind of silly. They have extended the Republican Party, the Democratic Party's voice into the real world of suburbia and smaller cities and towns, where Democrats either have to win or have to do better in the margins in order to win elections. And Joe Biden is kind of an important example of what people are prepared to get behind, and what they're getting behind him tends to move him. So I think the Democratic Party is in a much better shape in terms of melding together its progressive and its mainstream wings than the Republican Party has been for quite some time.
I want to briefly mention, if you, those out there of you who have a question for Theda Skocpol, please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Particularly, we got a question in that was actually mirroring something that I had been curious about, and there was a question of whether the Koch organization is really still a vibrant feature in American politics right now. I'm pretty sure they were not particularly Trump supporters early in the 2016 cycle, although I think they did remain active in some congressional races. Have they been sidelined, or are they still very active in trying to steer American politics in a certain direction?
You know, my colleagues and I have done research on the Koch network, which treats it as something other than the brothers themselves, one of whom has died, David, and something other than simply their own personal checkbooks. our analysis lays it out as a set of intersecting organizations with Americans for Prosperity at the core, and that's a federated organization that engages in both electoral and policy campaigns by melding expertise, money, and activists. They're still there, you bet they are. The brothers themselves did not endorse Donald Trump in 2016. They have not endorsed him this time. They don't like to be tied to losers, and they suspected he would lose then. And the Koch network's billionaires, the 400 to 500 billionaire families that meet regularly, back then preferred Marco Rubio. But the great thing about the Koch network is that it is incredibly flexible. So you can not arrive at any one decision about a presidential candidate and redirect the money to the Senate contests, which is what's happening again this time. And the voters you turn out for those contests also vote for the top of the ticket. They know that, that's what they're doing. They have gotten huge payoffs out of the Trump administration. They have shaped the tax policies. They have shaped the environmental policies. They don't care for the immigration policies. They don't care for that crude racism. And I've interviewed Koch network members, wealthy Koch network members, who will tell me, well, that's just the price we have to pay. You know, his followers, his grassroots followers like that, but we think he's doing a great job with the taxes and the business regulation. So they're still there, they're still spending, they're still organizing. They're not the face of the Republican Party right now. It's much more this ethno-nationalist thrust under Trump that has become the face of the Republican Party, and the enduring Christian right worldview, which I would not underestimate. I think these folks are good citizens. They turn out to vote. They follow politics closely. They have both elite and popular roots, and they are at the core of the Republican Party, and the Republican Party is about to deliver what they want. Amy Coney Barrett on the Supreme Court. And you may have noticed in last night's debate, the one time that Mike Pence got really steely and specific was when he conveyed that come hell or high water, or I guess heaven or high water, Amy is going to be on the Supreme Court. They are delivering exactly what their minority core supporters, as well as their elite free market billionaire supporters, want. And the Koch network is advertising on behalf of Amy Coney Barrett, not because they care about abortion, but because they care about the fettering of the federal government's regulatory capacities that she is going to help to deliver.
Should I jump in, or should we take more questions?
I don't know if you had another question you want to ask, or I could go to another audience question. Or
I did want to follow up with something. So one of the earlier questions I asked was about whether Trump would be as successful whether these movements would be as successful against Biden as they were against Obama. And one of the things that you were talking about was kind of this othering of the candidate to paint them as kind of like this existential apocalyptic threat. And I'm wondering if the selection of Joe Biden might kind of mitigate that, right? Maybe he's not as otherable as Barack Obama. I'm wondering if.
Well,
yeah.
I think he's seen as quite a threat by Protestant evangelical conservatives, but I think some conservatives in the coalition are not as afraid of him. And you actually see the Trump campaign thrashing around on that. They have not been able to other Biden to the same degree. And in fact, this morning, President Trump was trying to resurrect or create a bogey person in Kamala Harris in a way that she did not cooperate with last night. She was very, very careful to show deference to Joe Biden at every step. So, but I do want to say this. I do think that if the Democrats sweep the presidency and both houses of Congress again, you will see hardcore Tea Party types and the kinds of people who do those reopening protests. You're going to see them in the field again, and you're going to see a renewed effort to use any levers of power by elites on the Republican side to keep the Democrats from governing effectively. So they will try to run the same movie again. I just don't think it'll have quite as much passion behind it, because the research shows that anger at Barack Obama and fear of Barack Obama as the other was highly motivating, and our interviews showed that too. There's just no question the tinge of fear about him and everything he represents to older white conservatives was part of the formula for what happened in 2009 and beyond.
I have a question here from an audience member who wants to know if this year's polls carry some of the same issues as those in 2016. That is, do you think there's a chance that polls this year are underreporting or underestimating the Trump vote?
I'm not a pollster, and I think there are people here who have that expertise more than I do. I think we always have to recognize that polls can be, that when things are within 3 to 5 percentage points in a key state, that last minute trends that are not picked up in the final round of polls or systematic errors can make the difference. And I believe pollsters themselves have always said that. I don't think they were that off in 2016. I think we know that there was a lot of movement in the final 2 weeks of that campaign after the Comey letter. I'm keeping my eye on the state of Pennsylvania, which, by the way, plays a starring role in upending American politics, because several chapters are based on just extraordinary original research. One is a senior thesis turned into one of the chapters about the transition that occurred in the collar counties around Philadelphia and to some degree around Pittsburgh, as you saw suburban educated people moving from the Republican Party, where they had thought of it as McCain and Romney, to anti-Trump stance, spurred on by very active resistance networks in those areas. You saw the election of a whole series of Democrats to Congress in those races. Those trends, if anything, have continued and are going to deliver major margins for the Democrats, not just in the core center cities, but in the inner suburban rings around. Meanwhile, one of the counties that I've visited regularly, Luzerne County, will go for Trump again, but probably with less of a margin than it did last time, because it's a kind of downscale industrial area with some immigrant groups moving in, and creates fertile ground for the kinds of appeals to fear about immigrants that Donald Trump has and will feature. We also know that the resistance is present in 55 of the 67 counties. We did online questionnaires to find out what they did in 2018. They went door to door, and they changed the margins for such non-progressive Democrats as Senator Casey and Tom Wolf. So it's a good example of the way in which resistance people, who are often of somewhat more progressive left mind than the candidates they work for, nevertheless can change the equation for a whole range of Democrats across a key state. And this is the state we need to watch this time, because I think the Trump administration is trying to set up a situation in which they can challenge the vote count. And if it's within 5 percentage points and the margins show Trump ahead, they will try to stop the counting of mail ballots in Pennsylvania after the election. The only thing is, they've announced they're going to do it weeks and months in advance. That's given authorities in Pennsylvania a chance to take steps, including steps that are being taken in a lot of places to get poll workers, younger poll workers, to open more polling locations. Same thing has happened in Wisconsin. Same thing is happening in North Carolina. So I think there could be turbulence if it's within 5 percentage points in a key state like Pennsylvania. I think that's where Trump is putting all his marbles. But, you know, I don't think it's going to work this time. And I don't think the polls are that far off this time around. Or that last time around, for that matter.
So I think maybe I'll take another audience question.
Yeah,
Great.
let's do it.
So getting back into the apocalyptic talk, with both sides fearing they need to protect America from the other, Levitsky and Ziblatt's observations that the right is not following the political rules and norms, and your own research on revolutions, do you think the U.S. might be moving toward a cold civil war or even greater public unrest?
Well, there's a proto-fascist movement going on in the country. I mean, I don't think that you have to take my word for it. I mean, Senator Mike Lee today said that democracy is not the point. Prosperity and order. And I think there are many, many signs that Republican elites, as well as intensely organized popular forces, which are very real, by the way, in the Republican orbit, are willing to sacrifice majoritarian democracy. In my interviews, people often point out to me that the United States is not a majoritarian democracy. And of course, they're right about that. It never has been. They see it as a constitutional republic. So I think there's a real chance that some elements would turn to violence if encouraged. And the frightening thing is that we have an attorney general and a president who are encouraging extra legal resistance in some ways. But that is only going to play out in sustained violence and greater disorder if the election is close. And, you know, I'm a historical political scientist. I like to know how it turns out before I explain it. But I'm going to just inch out on a limb here and say, I don't think the presidential contest will be close this time. And I really think that the entire ball game for whether the United States comes through this period of frightening division and turbulence toward a somewhat more governable system rests on what happens with the Senate. If Biden is elected and the Democrats do not gain control of the Senate, then the possibilities for obstructing effective governance at a time when the country faces an economic crisis that's likely to be massive, unequal, and I hate to tell people prolonged, is pretty great. And if Democrats cannot, after all of this, deliver some effective solutions in some areas, at least, that they've highlighted, then I think we could have Trumpism without Trump's personal weaknesses, with somebody like Tom Cotton, for example, within 4 years. So, you know, I don't see this as a one-off. I think this election is critical, but it's one of a series that has to empower effective, inclusive governance with a willingness to reach out to those who feel defeated. And in that sense, Joe Biden, surprisingly enough, is exactly the right person. Who would have thought that this man, who really hasn't been that effective as a national political candidate, could turn out to be just right for the possibility, and I want to stress that word possibility, of both winning and reaching out to the other side. And at least in Cambridge, Massachusetts, I'm surrounded by people who deride him all the time for saying he'll work with Republicans. But that's what most Americans want to hear. Whether it works or not, they want him to try. The only thing is, it's so much better to reach out to compromise when you're in a position of strength. So he needs the Senate. And if he doesn't get it, and I'm not sure he will, I really am not. I think they could fall one short.
I had a question for you, Professor Lynn Schofield-Clark, who's a professor in our Media, Film, and Journalism department, wants to know, can you speak to the presence of younger people in the movements you've been studying? How do efforts to recruit them work? Are they leveraging social media? She raises the example of Turning Point USA and their outreach on Facebook with pro-conservative messaging.
Yeah, I think that on both sides, but especially the Democratic side, you do have lots and lots of organizations and efforts, including some in the Democratic Party itself, that believe that if you can tweet a lot, you can get young people to the polls. Now, I'm not sure that the research actually shows it's just that. The grassroots resistance I studied is actually older women who tend to be the mothers and grandmothers of the young people we're talking about. And I believe in the African American community too, there's a lot of research that shows, for example, that Doug Jones's victory in Alabama depended on a lot of older church women in the African American community, as well as the older white women in these resistance groups, not all of which are tied to Indivisible, but some of which are. Now, they do give their children and grandchildren a kick in the behind to get out to vote. And more than that, and there are a couple of chapters in the book that lay this out, and I think it may apply to Black Lives Matter too. A lot of the kind of magnification of some of these moments that have young people in the streets, for example, the post-Parkland movement, one of the chapters in Upending American Politics talks about why that was so much more effective in influencing governing agendas and even some legislation, even in some conservative places, than any other post-mass shooting movement has been. For this senior thesis was based on comparing all the way back to Columbine. And part of the answer is that the young people themselves were high schoolers, so they could organize, and they used the new media. So we do know that the new media are an important organizing tool for younger activists. But another part of it is that older women in these already active resistance groups turned out to support them. And if you look at the data on who marches that Dana Fisher has put together, almost every march in the Trump era has had about 60 to 80% of the participants have been these same older women that are the ones that organize the grassroots resistance groups. And in two of the communities I visited during this period, one of them in the heart of North Carolina, believe me, gun country, gun country all the way. The high schoolers had actually organized a Parkland march, and the female-led Indivisible chapter there had provided behind-the-scenes support for what they did. Totally behind the scenes. They didn't put themselves in front of the microphones. They weren't quoted in the newspaper, but they played a very important role. Same thing happened in Ohio, in central Ohio. So I suspect it happened in lots of places. And even if you look at some of the marches for racial justice that have gone on, up until this summer, a lot of them had older women as their most numerous participants. Now, this summer was different. It was young people who turned out, partly because I think the message about racial equality and the need for systematic action against racial oppression has gotten through to young people of all backgrounds and races in this country in a way that laid the groundwork for that explosion of activism during June and the rest of the summer. But let's face it, you also had a lot of young people who'd been cooped up for 3 months in their basements of their parents' homes. And this was a chance to get out there. The research shows, by the way, that they got out there in ways that were pretty safe, and that most of their older relatives stayed home in the same, there's a new study showing this. So part of the reason that the Black Lives Matter protests did not spur the spread of the virus is a combination of the behavior of the outdoor protesters and the fact that others in those communities stayed home. But it's my way of saying that in a period like we're in now, if you study social movements, you have to realize they're more than street protests. You have to look at the way in which street protests feed into ongoing organizational activities in and around the parties, how they affect elections or don't affect elections, and how one movement builds on another. And that's what we've seen in this resistance period, even to a greater degree than we saw during the Tea Party period.
So you did mention the Black Lives Matter movement, and this kind of brings up a different question that we've been thinking about, which is how portable are these new organizational movements? So largely what you talk about in the book is these movements are reactions to candidates, right? But Black Lives Matter is more policy or issue based. And so do you have any thoughts about, how effective these types of movements might, or how the effectiveness might differ between, for example, between policy and candidates, and what other kind of factors might weigh in?
What I have are questions. I haven't done research on the Black Lives Matter movement, and I'm hoping a lot of other people get out there. I did a little bit of reading about its origins and development leading into this summer for a lecture I gave. And, one of the things I found fascinating was that the movement made a transition from being a hashtag and an online activation of large numbers of people to being 30 chapters in various cities during the Michael Brown protests, which obviously played a role in the 2016 election. And people met traveling to those protests outside of St. Louis from the various cities. That's exactly the way people met who formed local tea parties and who, after the Tax Day protests in 2009, and many of those who formed local resistance groups met traveling to the women's marches in January 2017. So this phenomena of people who don't know each other but are like-minded about a passionate moment, a sparking moment, and then go on to use a combination of online and face-to-face organizing techniques in a location is a thread that I think we're seeing across some of these movements. Now, the difference for Black Lives Matter is that it is particularly the focus, it's not its only focus, but the focus on radically reforming the way police operate is both a national cause that's fueled by creating these interconnected local efforts, this combination of online and face-to-face, but it doesn't have an obvious national policy solution. Yes, we can argue about what Congress is going to pass or what presidents are going to do, but the hard work of changing police practices and ways of dealing with family incidents or instances of mental health problems has to happen in local communities and requires changing local political power structures. So Black Lives Matter just has a much harder cause than, for example, a year-long agitation against the Affordable Care Act or for the Affordable Care Act, which was central to the resistance in the Tea Party. And I don't know exactly how that's going to play out. I think the visibility of local police abuses, which have been going on for a long time without being visible, fuels a national uprising about dealing with them. But the solutions are going to have to be worked out in a lot of different local places. And they're going to require, for example, pushing back on police union capacity to protect abusive police. And that is, I don't know to what degree street protests are going to be able to get at that particular hard nut to crack.
So we are just about out of time. Theda, I really want to thank you for your participating in this today. This has really been fascinating, and
Thank you very much.
You're talking
Thank you
about
for having me.
the research.
Enjoyed it. Great questions, and I hope all goes well where you are.
Thank you. As well with you. And thank you to our audience members who joined us today. I want to thank Aaron Dietrich and Alicia McDowell for helping to put this all together. There should be a recording of this conversation available probably in about a week. We'll be posting it on the Center on American Politics website at that point, du.edu/American Politics. Thank you all. Take care and stay safe.
Right. Bye-bye.